The version 7.0 livestream revealed that all Khaenri'ahns are descendants of the Tsaritsa, and ever since hearing that, I've not been able to stop thinking about what it does to Khaenri'ah's entire story. Because Khaenri'ah is the nation Dainsleif calls the pride of humankind. It had no ruling god, and its people believed humanity could govern itself. Yet now we know that its original bloodline came from the woman who would eventually become the Archon. At first, I thought that created a contradiction. Why would the descendants of a divine being create a nation where no god was allowed to rule? So I went looking through Khaenri'ah's history to see if I could figure out what happened between the Tsaritsa and her descendants. But the answer does not start in Khaenri'ah. I think its true beginning lies in the story of Koitar and the ruins of Hyperborea. Because long before Khaenri'ah fell, Koitar wanted to create a world where people no longer needed heaven's permission to live. This became her goal after learning about what lies beyond the world from Sutervoinen. Hyperborea tried to turn that idea into an actual Elysium for humankind alone. And then Khaenri'ah appears later as a nation governed by humans. The knowledge they developed reaches into powers normally only controlled by the divine, and after Khaenri'ah's destruction, the Tsaritsa's demeanor changes, and she, along with her descendant Piero, go on to start the organization we know as the Fatui. To me, that looks like the same goal continuing through different parts of history. An idea born from Koitar and Sutervoinen became an engineering project in Hyperborea before taking the form of ordinary life in Khaenri'ah. Its destruction may be the reason that Tsaritsa is now targeting heaven itself. I'm Zerani, and today we're going to follow how the rebellion against the heaven moves from Koitar into Hyperborea through Khaenri'ah's bloodline and eventually into the Fatui's rebellion against the heavenly principles we're dealing with now. Because the Tsaritsa's current revolution may be part of a war that led to the downfall of Hyperborea and the Cataclysm of Khaenri'ah. Once the livestream dropped the reveal that the Tsaritsa is basically the mother of Khaenri'ah, I went back to the Travail trailer. Dainsleif describes her as a god with no love left for her people, nor do they have any left for her. And for years I assumed her people meant Snezhnaya. But now, Dainsleif is also one of her descendants, and to me, this changes what his description may have been alluding to, because somewhere in the Tsaritsa's history, love becomes connected to her rebellion. And for a long time, the obvious assumption was that Khaenri'ah's fall created that rebellion. Venti tells us that the Tsaritsa changed after the Cataclysm, so at the time it made sense to think that that was the moment she decided to turn against Celestia. But then you look at Hyperborea. The idea behind her rebellion seems to be much older than the Cataclysm itself. So now I think Khaenri'ah's destruction changed the way Anastasia would pursue that goal. It showed her that humanity could build a civilization free from divine rule and still lose everything the moment the heavenly principles decided it should end. And to understand where that goal may have started, we need to talk about Koitar herself. Hymns of the Far North describe Koitar as the wife of Sutervoinen and the first fairest daughter of the creator god. Other northern lore connects her to the titles First Angel and Dawn's Navigator. So naturally, Koitar, being the first angel, put her near the top of the divine hierarchy as the fairest daughter of Phanes. But in the lore of Azure Light, she turns against them. Koitar speaks to the angels who had submitted to the primordial master to reject his rule and says that the world should be entrusted to those who live in it. She imagines a future where nations no longer have to beg for permission to live. The veil over the world is torn open, and a new dawn reaches the people trapped below it. And that immediately reminded me of what the Fatui are trying to do. Piero wants to seize authority from the gods and rewrite the rules of destiny, while the Tsaritsa is collecting the Gnosis for a rebellion against the heavenly principles to free humanity from its control. Koitar seems to be describing the same type of future, long before the Fatui ever existed. Due to this rebellion, the heavenly principles separated Koitar from Sutervoinen, casting one out of Teyvat and leaving Koitar with the loss of memory in their final battle. So now we have an ancient woman from the far north whose love was destroyed by heaven and her memories wiped as punishment for rebelling against the heavens, which obviously made me wonder if Koitar could be the Tsaritsa. That would explain how the Tsaritsa is old enough to stand at the beginning of Khaenri'ah's bloodline and why her rebellion resembles a much older conflict in the north. But unfortunately, that's all speculation. Maybe Koitar has forgotten herself, and over time became known as Anastasia, later on becoming the Tsaritsa. If she's not Koitar, then she may be a descendant, or Snezhnaya is still hiding how Koitar's purpose motivates Anastasia today. At this point, I still don't know if they're the same person. What keeps me thinking about the connection, though, is what happened between the beginning of Koitar's rebellion and its final battle, the Elysium Project. there is a letter written during the 10th year of the Elysium project. The writer placed it inside a time capsule for someone they believed would live in a much more advanced future. They expected humanity to master the elemental energy inside the earth and eventually travel beyond the false sky without relying on gifts from the gods. By the end of the letter, they're asking whether their descendants can create a world, which sounds insane at first, but Hyperborea already believed it was building the beginning of that future. Its people had united around the Elysium project, which was meant to create a world for humankind alone. The project was guided by the Dawn's Navigator and the Exalted Saint. Those titles lead back to Koitar and Sutervoinen. So Koitar's promise of a world entrusted to the people living in it became something Hyperborea was actually trying to construct. Their researchers were altering the seeds of life so new humans could wield elemental forces. Meanwhile, the Mech and Nekos raised a tower towards the heavenly city. Hyperborea was trying to reach a point where humanity no longer depended on the firmament, and the writer of the time capsule genuinely believed someone in the future would finish what they had started. A black stone descended upon the frozen north, and their Elysium never reached the future it was written for. Yet when I started comparing Hyperborea to Khaenri'ah, the goal felt incredibly familiar. Khaenri'ah also believed human knowledge could reach powers normally associated with the divine. They created life through chemia, and built machines capable of fighting beings far larger than the people controlling them. The country was governed by human rulers and became a home for people who had abandoned the gods of other nations. But the idea behind Hyperborea appears again inside Khaenri'ah in a much more complete form. What existed as the Elysium project in Hyperborea eventually appears somewhere else, and somewhere around the beginning of that country is the family we see in Sudden Snow. A child turns towards her and calls her mother, and in that child's eye is the same star-like pupil we associate with Khaenri'ah. Then we see Ronova tearing a photo of that memory in half, leading us all to believe there is someone else. Naturally, my first assumption was that this could be the child's father, although the trailer never gives us enough information to know who was removed. Ronova talks about a love that was spoiled by the heavenly principles. The Tsaritsa responds as if the happiness inside that image has become so distant that she can almost question whether it was ever real. Before the 7.0 livestream, the child's eye made it seem like someone from Khaenri'ah had entered the Tsaritsa's family, and that's what most people had speculated. But now it looks like the inheritance is coming from the opposite direction. The child could have a Khaenri'ahn pupil because Khaenri'ah came from the Tsaritsa's family. This is really eye-opening because even more interestingly, when we remember what Koitar tells us, according to him, Khaenri'ah began with a single bloodline. Later, people from other nations abandoned their gods and became Khaenri'ahn citizens. That is why there is a difference between the pure-blooded Khaenri'ahns and the people whose family arrived from somewhere else. The 7.0 livestream finally tells us that original bloodline begins with the Tsaritsa. So could the child in Sudden Snow be an early member of the family that eventually founded Khaenri'ah? I think at this point that is most likely the case. We still do not know the child's name or how many generations separate this family from Khaenri'ah's founding. But the star-shaped eye is difficult to dismiss now that we know the Tsaritsa's descendants became the original Khaenri'ahns. Aligning this new information next to Koitar and Hyperborea, Khaenri'ah's godlessness starts making way more sense. Dainsleif says that Khaenri'ah had no god because it never had a god to begin with. But with this lore reveal, that sounds almost like a contradiction. Khaenri'ah's claim was about who governed the nation. The Tsaritsa was not sitting on its throne, and she had not become the Archon yet. But we know that you don't necessarily need to be an Archon in order to be a part of divinity. The Beli Tsar remained Archon until the Cataclysm, which means Anastasia lived for an unknown amount of time before she inherited the throne. And we know she used to have a good relationship with Barbados before the Cataclysm, so her descendants could have founded Khaenri'ah long before she became one of the seven. Having a divine ancestor does not change the fact that Khaenri'ah was governed by humans. King Ermin came from his own royal line. When his strength failed, the Alberich clan served as regents and openly acknowledged that they did not carry royal blood. Khaenri'ah's political authority remained inside a human system, and you can see the same idea inside everything the nation created. Even after the country was destroyed, the Abyss Order and the Loom of Fate eventually manufactured the ley lines needed to reconstruct new Khaenri'ah. At this point, it becomes hard for me to see Khaenri'ah as a family that simply rejected the Tsaritsa. Its people may have inherited the same desire we already saw in Koitar and Hyperborea. The world should belong to the people who actually live in it. Hyperborea had started the rebellion against the heavens, and Khaenri'ah turned the idea into a nation where generations of people could live under human rule, away from Celestia. And for an unknown amount of time, it actually worked. People who no longer wanted to live beneath the gods of their homelands could go to Khaenri'ah and become part of that country. So if Koitar's purpose somehow reached the Tsaritsa, or at the very least her descendants, Khaenri'ah may have been the closest anyone ever came to completing that ancient goal. The Cataclysm revealed Khaenri'ah's fatal flaw. Khaenri'ah had only removed divine authority from inside its own country. Celestia's control over the surrounding world was still there, and 500 years ago the heavens decided Khaenri'ah's fate. Khaenri'ah was destroyed during the Cataclysm, but its pure-blooded people were not allowed to die with it. Ronova imposed the curse of immortality on them, and as we learn from Capitano, this immortality does not preserve the person the way you would normally expect. His body has continued rotting for centuries while the curse keeps him alive inside his armor. Dainsleif describes it as something that slowly permeates the victim until it replaces them. So considering that those pure-blooded Khaenri'ahns are the descendants of the Tsaritsa, Renova's punishment starts to look more like a nation-sized family tragedy that at its core is connected to the Tsaritsa. The Tsaritsa tells Ronova that death is not the enemy of love. For people like Dainsleif, Capitano, and Piero, death became the one thing that Ronova would not allow them to reach. And that also makes the theme of preservation along with Cryo's imagery surrounding the Tsaritsa feel especially cruel. Snow can preserve the shape of something after all of its warmth is gone. And that is basically what the immortality curse does to her descendants. Their body remains while time slowly takes away everything that body was supposed to preserve. The reason Ronova punished them this way is still hidden from us, but we do know what that punishment did. Khaenri'ah tried to create a future controlled by humanity, and its original bloodline was stripped of control over its own death. The survivors then left that destruction carrying very different ideas about what should happen next. Piero eventually went to Snezhnaya after the Cataclysm, but before the Cataclysm he had served as a royal mage in Khaenri'ah and tried to warn King Ermin about the disaster approaching the nation. He was not able to change the king's decision, so Piero survived knowing that he had seen the danger and still failed to stop it. Sometime after the fall of his nation, he meets the Tsaritsa. According to the Pale Flame artifact set, Piero decided to devote himself to Her Majesty, the one who understood his pain. That shared pain became the beginning of the Fatui, and with the new lore, this gives them a whole new layer to their relationship. Together they are preparing to challenge the authority connected to the nation's destruction. However, other survivors chose a different path. Koitar chose the Abyss, after being briefly blessed by Vedifulnir to help his son Caribert, who had transformed into a Hilichurl. His grief eventually led to the creation of the Abyss Order, which now follows the Traveler's sibling and has completed the ley lines of New Khaenri'ah through the Loom of Fate. While Dainsleif has seemingly rejected both paths because he refuses to restore Khaenri'ah through a plan that could destroy the people still living in Teyvat, and has never joined the Fatui. So the survivors all came out of the same catastrophe without agreeing on how to fix it. Bringing the nation back became the Abyss Order's answer, but even if they successfully restore Khaenri'ah, Celestia could still destroy it again. And I think that is the problem Piero and the Tsaritsa are actually trying to solve through the Fatui. Khaenri'ah had already shown that a human nation could govern itself. Its destruction exposed how vulnerable that independence remained inside a world ruled by the heavenly principles, however. Celestia does not need to sit on the throne of Khaenri'ah if it can send judgment down from the sky. And this is where the Fatui's plan comes into play. They are removing the Gnosis from the nations while Piero prepares for a rebellion that he says will seize authority from the gods. That goal reaches beyond rebuilding Khaenri'ah, by targeting the system that brought about the Cataclysm itself. With all this in mind, looking back at Koitar and Hyperborea, it starts to look like the same project learning from each failed attempt to defeat Celestia. The world Koitar wanted became the Elysium project and eventually took the form of a human nation in Khaenri'ah. Once that nation was destroyed, the final hurdle became clear. The Tsaritsa's rebellion has to reach heaven. Otherwise, every new Elysium can be destroyed exactly like the one before it. If you made it this far, then you are exactly who I make these videos for. Right now, most of the people watching this channel are not subscribed. So if you enjoy deep Genshin lore and theories like this one, consider subscribing. Your support is what allows me to keep making these videos and continue pursuing my dream of doing this full time. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.